Okay,
Go
I'll go.
for it.
Um, well, thank you, everyone in Dover. If you, assuming you're all in Dover or have some connection to Dover, thank you for coming. My name is Anders Morley, and I am here to talk this evening about my book, This Land of Snow. And my book, I feel like I should be saying something by way of introduction. I don't know. I live in Littleton, but I'm speaking to you from Amherst right now, just because this is where my parents live and I've come down to visit. And I guess that's all the context you need. So my book, This Land of Snow, is about a journey that I made in 2012 and 13 during the winter, 4 months of winter. And I spent those 4 months kind of living outside and traveling across a pretty large section of northwestern Canada on cross-country skis. It's not really a book about skiing, although obviously, since it was something I was doing every day, there was a lot of skiing in it. But for me, skiing was just kind of the most sensible way of moving across a winter landscape, and it's something that I'd done for a long time. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. I wanted to write a book that was more than just kind of an adrenaline-driven adventure, and so I wanted it to be something that would appeal to people who weren't skiers themselves, to people who maybe weren't even necessarily particularly adventurous, armchair adventurers. And so one of the things that I tried to do to make the book appeal to a wider audience was to put the story of the journey in the context of my life, because it seemed like some of the events leading up to and then even afterwards were kind of important to the story itself. And then I also thought it might be a chance to look at a few things that interested me, and those were winter as an ecological phenomenon, winter as a cultural phenomenon, and then I wanted to think a little bit also about the way that we as a species move across landscapes, and especially winter landscapes. And so I took all these things and tried to weave them together into some kind of a cohesive narrative that I hope is entertaining to readers. So what I'd like to do this evening is first talk a little bit about the background of the journey, how and why it occurred to me to do something like this that some people think is crazy. And I'm going to show you some pictures as I take you along, and then we're going to go along the trail, and I'll stop at 2 or 3 places and read a little bit from the book for you. And then in the end, hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So bear with me just a second, and we're going to share the screen so that we can see some pictures. Okay. Can I have a thumbs up, Susan? Okay, good. I'm going to move you over here and then go over to full screen. All right, there we go. Okay. So one of the questions that I had to answer for myself, really, when I sat down to start writing a book about this journey was, where do I start? And one of the answers I came up with, there are a few, but one of them was with this guy. This is Tony Matt. Since this is a New Hampshire crowd, some people in the audience may have heard of him. Tony Matt was an Austrian ski racer who, in 1938, when the Germans annexed Austria, he left the country in the company of a few other Austrian ski racers and ski instructors. And they all came en masse to New Hampshire and landed in North Conway, where they started what I think was the first alpine ski school in the United States. But Tony Matt is best remembered today not as a ski instructor, but as a ski racer. And he's especially remembered for participating in a race down the slopes of Mount Washington in 1939. And that race was called the American Inferno. It was actually run 3 times. This was the last time. And the existing record for the 4-mile course when Tony Matt showed up in 1939 was somewhere north of 13 minutes. Tony Matt ran the race and managed to cut the time down to 6 minutes and 29 seconds. So he halved the existing record. And one of the reasons that he was able to do that, ski historians think, is that he he had intended to do a few turns before going over the head wall of Tuckerman Ravine, which you see at the middle of the picture. But he miscalculated and ended up just shooting straight over the head wall, which is basically vertical, and then shoosing the rest of the way down the ravine and into the woods, down the Sherburne Trail to the bottom of the mountain. And by the time he got there, it was only 6 minutes and 29 seconds had passed, which is absolutely crazy if you have any idea what skis looked like in 1939. And then consider that he's wearing leather boots with a cable binding, a cable that just wrapped around his heel, essentially, and connected to this wooden plank. Now, this is a story that my dad used to love to tell me and my brothers when we were kids. We did a lot of hiking on and around Mount Washington. And we also did lots of downhill skiing at Wildcat Mountain, just across the valley. And so this was kind of the view that we had. And he would tell the story over and over. And in his telling, Tony Matt came charging down the mountain. And when he got to Pinkham Notch, he was greeted with cheers, but he was so shaken up because he had just done this thing that was, he could easily have killed himself. He was terrified that he just took his skis off and marched over to his car with them and put his skis down in front of his car and drove over them, snapped them in half, and then drove off and never skied again. And so I'd heard this story many times, and it was very memorable, and this had this dramatic ending. And so when the time came to sit down and start writing my own ski story, it kind of resonated with me because it seemed to contain a psychological insight, and that was that sometimes it's possible to take our enthusiasms a little bit too far. And that's certainly a spirit that pervades my own book about skiing. I started skiing when I was 5 years old. It was downhill skiing at first, and then it was another 5 years or so before I discovered cross-country skiing. And it was sort of an accidental discovery. I found a pair of old wooden skis in my parents' cellar and pulled them out, dusted them off, and then found the boots that went with them. And they had belonged to my mother once, and they happened to fit me. And so I stepped into the boots and clipped into the 3-pin bindings and made off into the woods. And really my relationship to skiing, my approach to skiing, to cross-country skiing anyway, hasn't really evolved much beyond that. It's just sort of a way of getting around the woods in the wintertime. I've increased, I guess, the scale of things. Now I'm gonna have to fast forward to get this story moving along about 20 years from that last picture. And when I was in graduate school, I needed to learn to read German pretty quickly. And so I decided that the best way to do that was to go to Germany for a few months and enroll in a language course. And so that's what I did. Well, while I was there, I met a woman, the woman you see in the picture, whose name is Elena. And she was in the same course, but she had come from Italy. So we fell in love, became a couple, and a couple of years later, I found myself rather unexpectedly living in Italy, in her country, in northern Italy, in the city called Bergamo, which is right at the foot of the It's kind of right where the foothills of the Alps start, as you can see in this picture. And I lived there for the better part of a decade. And there were many things I liked about it. But after 7 or 8 years there, I started to experience this creeping sense of unease and like a sort of, I don't know. It was certainly homesickness was part of it. I missed sort of the open spaces and quiet of northern New England, and I missed winter. But it was more than that. It was more than that. I just, something about the shape that my life had taken it certainly wasn't what I'd expected it to be, but it also wasn't terribly satisfied. And so I was kind of going through this existential crisis, I guess. And it was in the midst of this that one day I picked up a copy of National Geographic magazine. And when I got home, I opened it up and it flopped open to this page. It was a 2-page spread, this picture. And before I'd read the caption or had any idea what I was looking at, something about this picture seemed to cry out to me and say, this is what you need to be doing. This is the cure to your crisis. And so, I mean, the cross-country skiing is evident. I'd been interested in that for a long time, but I'd also for a long time wanted to go on some kind of a long self-propelled journey, like the Appalachian Trail or something. And suddenly it occurred to me that I could put these two things together, this love of ski touring, cross-country skiing, and this dream of going on some kind of a really long journey. And I could go on a literal cross-country ski trip. And so I started to daydream about this all the time, and then soon the daydreaming gave way to more concrete planning as it occurred to me that this was something that I really wanted to do. I started spending more time up in the Alps, touring in the following winter, and kind of thinking about it in terms of planning or practice or something like that. And I also started to do a lot more reading about other people who had explored on skis. One of the best known of whom was Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof Nansen was a Norwegian explorer, best remembered for being the first person to cross the Greenland ice cap. And then later he made the most successful attempt that had been made until then to reach the North Pole. He didn't quite make it, but anyway, Nansen had been kind of a hero of mine for a long time. And one of the things that I really loved about Nansen, that I remembered from a biography I'd read of his years before, was that he seemed to have this similar idea of cross-country skiing that I had. And that is, it was just kind of the way you got around in the wintertime. And there was this lovely story that I remembered reading of him when he was a student in Bergen on the west coast of Norway. His family lived in Oslo on the eastern side of the country, and they're about 300 miles apart. And one year when he was at university and the winter holidays came around and all of his friends were getting on the train to go back to Oslo, he decided that he would rather ski. And so he just tossed some stuff in a backpack and headed off to ski 300 miles over the mountains to see his family. And so I saw my journey as this kind of thing. It was just sort of this ordinary journey that happened to be extraordinary in its length. But other than that, it was just kind of like going for a walk in the wintertime. Now, I'm going to keep it on that slide for a minute. The problem with all this was that it was kind of, all of this was happening in my head. It was like this inner monologue. It wasn't really a conversation. And I, several years before, had married Elena, the woman I mentioned earlier. And, you know, we had a pretty happy marriage and whatnot. But for whatever reason, it just didn't occur to me to bring this up with her. And so when I finally brought it up one day, it was an idea that I had become very attached to. And so when she heard me say that this was something I would like to do, it sounded to her like I was announcing my intention to embark on, to take a winter off and then go into these remote and dangerous places. And in retrospect, that probably is the way that I presented it to her. So she did not respond well to this announcement. We can just call it an announcement. For two reasons. First, because of the way that I had done it, just kind of dropped it out of the blue. And then secondly, because she thought this was a completely insane idea. She couldn't understand why I was interested in doing this to begin with. She doesn't like winter. She's not an especially outdoorsy person. And so everything about it was just disagreeable to her, to say the least. And it became this source of tension. And then worse, it kind of became a wedge that kind of drove us farther and farther apart over the course of the following year. But nevertheless, 14 months after that initial conversation, here I was at the bus station in Vancouver, ready to head north to begin my journey. And at this point, you know, this was 14 months after I had talked to Elena about this idea. At this point, things had so deteriorated in our marriage because of this, or at least it seemed like it was because of this, that I was convinced that I was not, that the chances were very, very high that I was not going to go back to Italy afterwards, and that the decision to go on this journey would mean the end of my marriage. And so this story of a marriage in apparent downward spiral is a story that I tell in the book. It kind of parallels the story of the journey itself. I don't spend as much time on it, but and it's there right to the end, and I loop back to it at the end. So I'm not going to say very much about it in this evening's talk, but I will mention it again at the end as I'm concluding. So from Vancouver, I took a series of boat rides and then eventually a larger, sort of very large ferry up the Inside Passage, which is the channel that runs up through the islands along the British Columbia coast and then eventually into Alaska. And I was headed for a little town in northern British Columbia. It's actually Canada's northernmost Pacific port. It's called Prince Rupert. It's just a few miles shy of the Alaska Panhandle. And Prince Rupert claims to be the rainiest town on Earth, but as we were coming into port, in which you see in this picture, the sky kind of opened and it became sort of sunny, about as sunny as it does there, which to me seemed like a good omen. Now in Prince Rupert, I didn't expect to find snow. It's kind of they have sort of these mild winters like in Seattle or Vancouver and Juneau and places like that. And so it snows up high, or otherwise you have to go inland. And so my plan was to take my skis and my sled and a few other things and put them on a Greyhound bus and have them freighted inland to the first town inland, which was 90 miles to the east. And it was called Terrace. And then I would walk until I reached my things. And so that's what I did. Now, fortunately, when I got to Terrace, and this was late November at this point, the first snowstorm of the year had come into town just a few hours before me, and it snowed for 2 days straight, and it accumulated about 1.5 feet, and more than that up in the mountains. So that was good. And from that point on until the end of my journey in March, I would never again see an unsnow-covered landscape. So I was very fortunate as far as snow went that year. Another thing in Terrace was that I realized by the time I got there that I was carrying far more equipment with me than I wanted to be carrying. And so I checked into this motel and spent a couple of days sorting through my kit and getting its weight and bulk down to something that seemed more manageable. And then with that, I was ready to head into the mountains. Now, my first objective was to cross the coast mountains. Now, in a minute, I'm going to show you a map so that you'll be able to orient yourselves a little bit better. So my first objective was to cross the coast mountains. So there are two mountain ranges that run north to south down British Columbia: the Coast Mountains in the west, which are just the northern extension of the Cascades. They go up from California through Oregon and Washington. And then the Rockies on the eastern side of the province. And now the little sub-range of the Coast Mountains where I was called the Kitimat Range. And so I was going to cross the Kitimat Range from this town of Terrace to another a little village really called Telkwa, which is about 100 miles to the east. And in order to do that, I had to ski up a valley, the valley of the Copper River, and then cross a pass and then go down another valley to this town of Telkwa. And so I headed into the mountains, and it was there was a lot of snow, but it was still pretty warm. It was early winter and fairly close to the ocean, so it was kind of sticky, and you can see there's a lot of moisture in the air. And in this picture, you can see just from what I'm wearing that it wasn't very cold. For the first 20 miles or so, there was a snowmobile track that I was able to follow, which made it kind of a nice way of easing into it. I didn't have to break my own trail, and so I could, build some strength and get used to being out there. And this picture was taken probably 3 days or so into the journey up to the pass, and I'm looking back towards the west, and so it's sort of like a staircase-like progression. Now, this picture is here as sort of a parenthesis for anyone in the audience who may not be a cross-country skier. Because a lot of people don't realize that it's possible to ski uphill, but in a journey like this, skiing uphill is essential. But you can ski uphill thanks to what are called climbing skins. And climbing skins are basically these pieces of fabric that adhere to the bottoms of your skis, and they have a diagonal, backwards-oriented nap to the fabric. And what that does is it permits you to slide the ski forward, but then if there's any backward pressure put on the ski, this fabric bites into the snow and keeps you from sliding back. And I had two types of skins, these short ones that you see in this picture, which gave me some traction, enough to pull my sled, but left some glide to the skis as well. And then I had full-length skins, which went from the tip to the toes, and those are for climbing steeper terrain. And you can go up surprisingly steep stuff. So that thanks to the skins, I was soon up in terrain that looked like this, up in the middle of the mountains. And I think this is a good place to read a first passage about skiing, approaching the pass. And so I'll do that. So this little part of the Kitimat Range was divided into another range called the Howson Range, which is still smaller. The The peaks of the housing range, jutting skyward to the south, were daunting. Sometimes they were horrifying. They were massive, steep rocks. I had climbed higher mountains, but under much different circumstances. Mountains, when they're big enough, make their own weather, which here was a ravaging din of wind and flying snow. I skied first past Preterition Peak and then past Redemption Peak. I wondered what had gone through the head of the trembling Calvinist who named them. Once I entered Telqua Pass, which is laced across with a chain of small lakes, I had to traverse a row of talus slopes that angled like buttresses where the mountains met the valley floor. I had to cross one slope up high because alders had smothered the trail below. I proceeded nervously across what I knew might be a twitchy snowfield. Alone and with an anchor tied to my waist, my chances against an avalanche were hopeless. Suddenly, the white side of Redemption Peak peeled away from in front of me, and a boom hit my ears. Powder billowed out from the steep slope of the 8,500-foot mountain. It exploded hundreds of feet into the sky as if a buried charge had been set off. I stopped in my tracks, knowing I would have to cross the path of the avalanche in minutes. Turning around, my only other option would be going back across a slope that hadn't let go, that for all I knew could spring like a trap the moment my ski grazed it. At least the one ahead had already discharged. The sun was going down, and this was certainly no place to sleep. I snaked my way, cautiously, but with all the confidence I could muster, over the tortured drifts that drowned the summertime trail to the pass. Sometimes the drifts had sharp sides that dropped 5 feet, suddenly, like an ocean wave stacking. But my sled tracked beautifully and would swoop down them behind me in a graceful collapse, like a duck landing on water. The sense that every facet of my environment was working together gave me enough peace of mind to move along with calm focus. Still, I made a mad dash when I reached the densely piled snow of the avalanche path and came to the other side safely. When darkness fell before 4 o'clock in early December, there was no suitable place to camp. I realized now, too, that whatever trail lay ahead was obliterated by the avalanche fallout. I suspected it lay across a small river that was still running, but I had no strength to test my theory so late in the day. When snow moved in from the west, I decided to stop where I was. It was a fraught place, only feet from the base of a steep slope that held back the weight of a snowfield 1,000 yards long, another avalanche in the making. Above, white storms shrieked around the peaks like a baleful orchestra warming up to score the nightmares stalking my enfeebled consciousness. For the first time, I was afraid. All right, so that was kind of a scary moment. But a couple of days later, I finally reached the pass, and I made it over and then skied down the other side. That makes it sound much simpler than it actually was. And by the time I got down to this village of Telqua on the other side, about a week had passed. And that week was easily the most difficult week of my life, I can say in retrospect. And even so, in other words, even if my journey, the whole journey had been limited to that week, it would still be kind of the most challenging thing I've ever done. Now, when this picture is here, another one of these sort of parenthetical pictures. It's here to show it's not a great picture, but it's here to show my sleeping bag for anyone who happens to be interested in winter camping equipment. I won't say much about it, but there are a couple of distinctive features were the fact that it had a twin top, like so usually a sleeping bag has one part on the bottom and one part on the top. Here there were two tops, and you could take one off and change the position of them. So you could use just the thin top, just the thick top, or both together to get sort of 3 different temperature ranges. And then the other interesting feature was that it had a universal zip, or nearly so. And so you could, instead of being able to open the bag on just one side, you could open it all over and make sort of holes here and there. And so you could ventilate in all different ways, which is important when you're trying to regulate your temperature. And that's essential when you're camping in the cold, because you don't want to let yourself sweat, because any moisture that gets in the fabric is going to then become ice. Oh, sorry. So here finally is a map. So you can see the town of Prince Rupert, where I started, up the upper left-hand side of the map, just south of the Alaska line. And When I had initially thought of this journey in the comfort of my living room, I had thought it would be possible to ski all the way across Canada in a single winter. After about 3 weeks on the trail, it became apparent to me that at the rate I was going, there was no way that was going to happen. And so at that point, the focus kind of shifted to spending the entire winter out on the trail. And so the journey became as much about traversing a space as it was about traversing, sorry, as much about traversing a season as it was about traversing a specific space. But the route here pretty much corresponded to the first half of what I had planned to do. And the idea was basically to parallel the 55th, to straddle the 55th parallel, which kind of corresponds to the heart of the Boreal forest ecosystem, which is the largest ecosystem in Canada, and it's like covers the whole central and central northern part of the country. It's that's the, if anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, Boreal forest is that ecosystem that is sort of spruce trees and northern pines and firs, evergreens, and then birch and aspen as well. And it's the same kind of forest you find in Siberia or in Scandinavia. And historically, going way back, this is in Eurasia. This is where it was in this kind of environment that skiing first emerged as a cultural phenomenon. And so I loved this idea of there being sort of a symbiotic relationship between skiing and the Boreal forest. And so that was one of many reasons that I chose this area for my journey. I had to sort of patch together my own route. There isn't a trail and a single established trail that goes across this part of Canada. And so that meant a lot of time studying maps beforehand. And I used trails in that first mountain crossing section I described. For instance, I was just using an ordinary like a hiking trail. But I also found myself having to rely on other ways across the landscape. And so in British Columbia, there are thousands and thousands of miles of logging roads that wend their way into every remote corner of the province. And so I often relied on these, and most of those thousands of miles in any given winter are not kept clear, because it's not really worthwhile keeping them clear unless timber is actively being harvested in a given area. And so most of them are just these single lane, unimproved gravel roads that lie under a few feet of snow all winter long, waiting for a cross-country skier to come along. And that's what happened. So this is the only picture I had, a good picture I had of a logging road. So this was sort of a major artery that was going out to a camp or something, and there's a power line. So, but usually it was something much kind of more like skiing through a tunnel. And another possibility, and this is something that strikes a lot of people in the Northeast as unusual, but in Alberta, I skied for a couple of hundred miles along the railroads. But you have to understand that there are many places in Canada where there are railroads, but no automobile roads. And so these are just cargo railroads that move, cargo from one town to another town. And if it's just wilderness in between, there's no reason for there to be anything else but the railroad. And so you could be, 100 miles from the nearest road and skiing along a railroad. Now in this picture, I'm coming into a town, so there's a bit of life around. But usually it was something more like this. And on these lines, a train would come by at most once every 24 hours, but sometimes not for 2 or 3 days at a time. And after a train had passed, sometimes it would snow, and then the tracks themselves would be obliterated. And so it was much like skiing on a logging road. And then as I moved farther east, another possibility became lakes. Once I got onto the Canadian Shield, which is where that sort of bedrock core of the continent, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there were thousands and thousands of lakes. I mean, lakes everywhere, more lakes than land, probably, at least it seems like it. But of course, they're all frozen and covered in snow. And so at that point, it was just a matter of like connecting lake to lake, which can be done pretty easily because these lakes have historically and still today have been used by canoeists. And so there are little trails that connect them along this sort of standard routes. And so that became great for skiing. And then finally, snowmobile trails became another possibility, especially in Manitoba. There's an really extensive network of snowmobile trails. And again, these are in remote areas. So you're using snowmobile trails, but I would actually see a snowmobile on the snowmobile trails, maybe, once every 3 or 4 days. I think I'm going to actually do a second reading here, since we're on the subject of trails. So with all this like nuts and bolts thinking that I was doing about trails and about how I was going to find my way across the landscape, I would sometimes start to think about this question more philosophically or poetically. And that was kind of the spirit of this picture. I saw this little mouse track and thought, oh, I wish that I as a human could move as elegantly across the winter landscape instead of like clunking along with my creaky bindings and heavy sled. And I love this picture because you can see how the mouse's tail drags along and connects all the footprints. But I just want to read a bit from a chapter in the book about trails. And I move the conversation sort of specifically towards winter trails, but I start out more general. Trails are good infrastructure and so fundamental that even animals use them. Anyone who walks in the woods will easily notice these so-called game trails as soon as their eyes begin to shed their anthropocentric lenses. In the wintertime, deer and moose create yards, which are essentially circumscribed networks of paths, so that they can move about and access browse without each having to break its own trail. I've begun to learn on my journey that I too needed some kind of a trail in the snow to cover any great distance on my skis with my heavy load behind me. This much should have come as no surprise, for I've been a user of trails all my life. The mythical ideal of self-sufficiency that had grown in my consciousness during my years in Europe in reaction to a sense of claustrophobia began not only to fade, but to look downright dangerous. I started to realize that there was only a short step between the idealization of independence and misanthropy. But I still believed in the value of simplicity and lightness. Perhaps one of the virtues underlying a simple kind of infrastructure, like a trail, is its impermanence, or rather, its ability to impinge on the physical universe only when it is needed, and then to fade into near invisibility. These are really two separate things. In one sense, a trail has a lightness to it, such that if it is not used for a time, it will grow over or be snowed in. In the case of some winter trails, or be snowed in the case of some winter trails, and will be swallowed up by the landscape. In the other sense, even when a trail is still used regularly, in the intervals between uses, whether those intervals last hours or days or weeks, it has a way of blending into the background so that life around it can go on without distraction. But so many of our infrastructures, when they're unused and eventually abandoned, persist as scars that clutter the landscape and perhaps by their presence in our mindscape detract from our ability to think in closer harmony with our natural environment. It is precisely its ability to promote such harmony that may be another motivating virtue of an infrastructure like a trail. Portage trails foster harmony insofar as they respond to the locomotive needs of the land's inhabitants by bringing out the potential of lakes to act as passageways without bringing harm to the lakes themselves. There is also a harmony that arises out of the creation and use of a winter trail, whether it is traveled over on snowshoes, skis, dog sleds, or even a snowmobile. Rather than move snow out of the way like some nuisance as we do when we plow roads, the traveler on a winter trail adapts to float on top of it and, in the case of skis, even takes advantage of the snow's slipperiness to move faster. In a sense, the migratory paths of birds, whales, and caribou are a kind of natural, built-in infrastructure. But the same might be said of the Earth's valleys, mountain passes, rivers, and chains of lakes. The only technology, or better, technique, required to make them usable is the ingenuity of the user, whose virtues are transience, mobility, flexibility, and the fact that the mind needs no storage space. Perhaps grace, a species of intelligence, is the ability to recognize the most appropriate way of moving or not moving in any set of circumstances, paired with the skill requisite to act accordingly. All right. We're looking here at the Peace River. Peace River was the most important river that I crossed, and I crossed it very close to the border between British Columbia and Alberta. And it was kind of an exciting moment for me because the Peace River is a north-flowing river, and eventually via the Slave and Mackenzie rivers, it flows into the Arctic. And so just the idea of going over Arctic-bound water gave me kind of a thrill. And then I crossed into Alberta. Now, Alberta was a bit different from the other provinces that I skied through because the prairie pushes farther north there than it does in the other provinces. And so occasionally I found myself having to ski for a few days down onto these sections of open prairie. And it was January, so it was the coldest part of the winter as well. And I was unsheltered from the wind. And so some of the coldest moments of the entire winter were spent in northern Alberta. These are just a few pictures from along the way. So this is a pretty typical settled kind of place that I would come to in Alberta every few days. There were also more people in Alberta than any other provinces, just because the land is, I guess, a bit friendlier in some way. A grain elevator, which again, I didn't expect to see something like that as far north as I was. And in north central Alberta, I also came to the first really big lake that I skied across. I skied across many, many lakes over the course of the winter, but there were three really big ones. And the first was this one, Lesser Slave Lake. Now, this is what my camp looked like on any given evening with different backgrounds, of course. And I had a tunnel-shaped tent, which tends to be more wind-resistant than others. And is divided into two compartments. And so I would sleep in the compartment that is farther from us in this picture. And then in the nearer compartment, which is called the vestibule, is where I did my cooking. And after I'd finished my cooking every evening, which was fairly straightforward, I would have to keep my little camp stove going. And I would shovel load after load of snow into the pot and melt it into water and then boil it and then pour it into a thermos for 2 hours or so. And that would become my water for the next 24 hours. And it was while I was sitting there waiting for the snow to melt and boil that I would scribble in my diary a pretty detailed account of what happened every day. And of course, that later became important for writing a book. At this point, we're in Saskatchewan. It was February and the days were getting noticeably longer. It was still very cold, but sunny and just pleasant to be out. The snow kind of had a sparkle to it, and it slid along really nicely. I think some of the happiest moments of the winter were spent in Saskatchewan. On my skis, there was this picture emblazoned on the skis of Roald Amundsen, who was another Norwegian explorer. He was the first to reach the South Pole, and he had this sort of stern look on his face. And so every time I felt a bit discouraged or faint-hearted, it was enough to just look down and make eye contact with with Roald, and that would give me the kick in the pants that I needed. Here we're looking at the home of a character in the book. His nickname was the Cossack. His real name was Don, and he was this sort of crusty northern Canadian character, but he was of Ukrainian and Russian ancestry, and his friends called him the Cossack. But anyway, he was a dog musher and this confirmed bachelor and just sort of an all-around crusty northerner, and a highly entertaining person. And so there's an entire chapter in the book devoted to him, which is my favorite, I think. And it was in Saskatchewan that I was finally on the Canadian Shield. I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Shield is sort of the bedrock core of the continent, and the bedrock comes up really close to the surface of the earth there, and so you have all these lakes that form on top of it, essentially. And so pretty much from this point on, I was skiing along over lakes much of the time, maybe most of the time. These pictures here were taken on Lac La Ronge, which is the largest lake I skied across, one of the largest lakes in Saskatchewan. Where I crossed it, just to give you an idea, was between 30 and 40 miles wide. And that meant spending 2 nights out on the ice. And this picture here, again, Lac La Ronge, to give you kind of a sense of scale. That black line on the horizon is an island. It's not the mainland. And in this picture, one of my camps, you can see it, there's no land in sight. So it was a big lake. And it was quite cold, and there was just the slightest wind, but I've always been kind of skeptical of wind chill factor and like denied that it's important. But I'm telling you, when you're in the middle of a lake that's 40 miles wide, and there's just a little bit of wind, you feel the difference. And then here, finally, I am in Manitoba, and I'm just skiing. In this picture, I'm just skiing out of a little town called Flin Flon, which is a mining town in northern Manitoba, which explains the smokestack you see in the background. That's the chimney of the smelter. It was a copper mine, I think. And this picture was taken by a local newspaper reporter, which explains why it's better than most of the pictures. But you can kind of get a sense of what I looked like on an average day as I was moving across the landscape. And then there's this one from the same series heading south into Manitoba. Now in Manitoba, my journey kind of bent a little bit south towards the southeast, which was what my original route had done, and I was going to connect up with another chain of lakes. This ended up being the last 2 weeks or so of the journey. Now I want to read one final passage just kind of as I wrap up here. In this passage, there's a couple of things I should say to set it up. So I had been skiing on this network of long distance snowmobile trails that I mentioned. And when I say long distance, I mean like thousands of miles. And so one day I met this couple on snowmobiles. I was out in the middle of nowhere, hadn't seen anyone in days. And I could hear these motors, I could hear them, coming off for a very long distance. And then finally they caught up with me and they stopped, and they had stopped at a cabin a couple of days before where I had also been. There was kind of a log book in this little cabin that was part of the Snowmobile Trail network, and I'd written, where I'd started skiing. And so when they came up behind me, they knew who I was, and they're like, "I can't believe you've been skiing. This is British Columbia." And they said, if you're ever down in our town, which is where we're going now, and it's like at that point it was like 250 miles south of where they were, and they were going on snowmobiles home, just on this trail through the woods. So they said, if you make it down that far, drop us a line. Now my father, who has a small but significant role in the book, is also a skier, and from the moment I decided I was going to do this, he had said that he wanted to join me for a few days at some point. And so I thought the best place to do it was at the end. And so at that point, I kind of had a sense that things were winding down. And so I said, Dad, why don't you come out and join me in this area in central Manitoba, and there's this snowmobile network of snowmobile trails, and they've got these little warming huts. And I just met a member of the club, and he said we could sleep in the huts. And so my dad said, all right, sounds like a good idea. So he drove out to Manitoba, and like a week later or so, 10 days later, I don't know, we met in this little town where these people had come from. And they said, all right, you guys go out and ski for a few days. And then the last night, we're gonna a bunch of us snowmobilers are gonna come out and meet you at one of these cabins. And we're gonna throw you a big party to sort of to celebrate the end of the journey. And so I want to read a little bit about this last night on the trail. And so the guy that we met on the snowmobile was called Curtis, and his wife is called Colleen. And I think that's everything you need to know. So we're out in this cabin like 15 miles from the nearest road, and these snowmobiles come roaring up as it's getting dark. Curtis was still busy taking cutlery from bags and peeling tinfoil off the trays, warming on the wood stove. I watched him stealthily pull something from one of the bags and hide it behind his back, and then step gingerly across the room, wearing a Manitoban smile. "Hey, Dave," he said to grab my father's attention. "I've got a little surprise for you." I wondered how he could be so excited about giving a gift to someone he hardly knew. "Now I know you're a big Chardonnay guy," he said, "so I brought you something real special from my collection." From behind his back, he drew his finest bottle of Chardonnay and neatly flipped it around, resting it in the palm of his other hand for my father to scrutinize the label. "You're gonna love this one," Curtis said. Meanwhile, my mind was working hard, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that could have led to this bizarre outcome. I had only ever known my father to touch white wine under duress. He claims that even a whiff of it gives him a hangover. He drinks almost exclusively Cabernet Sauvignon and is, of his own admission, hardly a connoisseur. I thought, where on earth could Curtis have got this idea that my dad was a Chardonnay guy? The only possibility was that the topic of wine had somehow come up at Curtis's office after my father had arrived, and I stepped outside for a minute. Other than those few minutes, Curtis and my father had never been together in my absence. Now I could almost hear my dad joking that what he needed was a glass of wine to offset the stimulant effects of all the 5-hour energy shots he'd imbibed driving across the continent. Curtis, in order to advance the conversation, must have mentioned that he happened to be a wine lover himself and asked my dad whether he was particularly fond of any one variety. Do you like Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, he might have said, just to get the ball rolling. Again, I imagined my dad's voice. Chardonnay? Oh, I love Chardonnay. Something about the floral bouquet, the semi-dry, semi-sweet, je ne sais quoi. He would have been indulging in a trademark rhetorical habit of his that my brother, Dave, has long described disapprovingly as staking minor conversational gains on major practical risks. But now the chickens had finally come home to roost, and I intensely wished my brother could be there to see it unfolding. My father probably had no memory of this earlier conversation, and I could sense the desperation behind his smile as he showered profuse thanks on Curtis and Colleen. But in seconds, he'd worked out an ingenious strategy. He swept up 5 of the plastic goblets that the cooks had brought for the occasion and set them in a row. He pulled the cork and announced, "I think this calls for a toast." "It does indeed," shouted Colleen from the far side of the cabin. "Glass of Chardonnay, Colleen?" my father said, his voice rich with hope. "No, thank you, Dave," she replied. She stuffed her hand into a backpack and unsheathed a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. I'm a Cabernet drinker myself. Anything white kills me. My father was almost sweating, and he knew that I knew it. He redoubled his efforts. "Chardonnay, anyone? I feel terrible keeping this whole beautiful bottle to myself. Anders?" He tried, looking to me for succor. "No thanks," I said. "I think I'll stick to red tonight." And of course I helped him out with his Chardonnay. So that was kind of a fun little way to end things. And the next morning we skied out. It was frigid. It was mid-March, but it was as cold as January that last day. Now there are just 2 things I want to say in conclusion, and then we'll go to some questions. Now the first is, it's kind of a spoiler, but I like to tell people that the book has a happy ending. Now I talked about this, how when I set off, it looked like my marriage was in this downward spiral from which it would never recover. And when I got to the end of the journey, it looked still worse, and it continued to spiral downwards for several years. But amazingly to me, after 5 years, my wife and I managed to work through our differences and find our ways back to one another. And so now, since, in the last, almost 5 years again now, we've been back together. And so maybe it's a little corny to say so, but sometimes it's nice to know that there are true stories that have happy endings. And so this is one. And I'm sorry, because it is kind of a spoiler. And then the last thing I want to say, just to close the loop, I opened with the story of Tony Matt, the Austrian ski racer in the American Inferno on Mount Washington. And when it occurred to me that I might want to use this story, I thought I'd better check all the details of the story and make sure I have everything, correct and accurate. And so I read some accounts of Tony Matt in the American Inferno, and all the details of the race and the record were correct, but I couldn't find anything about him running over his skis and never skiing again. And so finally I wrote to a historian at the New England Ski Museum in Franconia and asked, and he said, "No, I know a lot about Tony Matt, and I'm certain that did not happen. Your father just made up his own ending to the story," which, as you see from that last reading, is not uncharacteristic. But nevertheless, it was kind of the story contained a truth of a different order. And so I decided to use it anyway. And I do say that it's not actually the way things ended. And on that note, I've finished. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, I'm all ears. And
Yeah, I was going to just give everyone the chance to talk because there's not so many. And so anybody
that's
who
great.
want to speak, please do. And otherwise you can mute yourself again.
And if people aren't comfortable speaking, they can put questions in the chat too, as far as I'm concerned.
Anders, what was the coldest that it was for you out there?
Yeah, so the coldest night that I was actually out sleeping was 37 below. The coldest temperature I experienced over the winter was 45 below. But fortunately, I was sleeping.
Good.
Yeah.
How many times did you get to sleep indoors in those huts?
Actually, fairly frequently. I mean, more than I expected. Like, so, you know, I wasn't I wanted to be in a place that was sort of a compromise between totally wild places and, you know, the civilization of the South. And so I would I think the longest I ever went without seeing a person was probably 7 or 8 days. But I would probably, most of the time, I would see people once a week or so, or maybe sometimes a little bit more. And it seemed like almost every time that I came into a little settled place, you know, people would start talking to me just because I was doing something unusual. And, you know, often those conversations would end with me being invited to spend a night and, you know, warm up and dry off in people's houses. And so I would say probably like once every 10 days or something like that, I would have a night, maybe even every 8 days, or like if you made an average over the course of the winter, which was nice, you know, and a chance to sort of dry things out a bit. Not that things were terribly wet, because it was, you know, well below freezing consistently for the whole time I was out. But
did you get a shower then too?
I got a shower, yeah.
Nice.
And I tell lots of those stories in the book because, like, I mean, these people were so friendly and generous with this perfect stranger. And by the time that I had set out on the journey, just because of kind of the way things had gone with my wife, I'd become kind of rancorous. And also, like, the whole idea was sort of getting away from civilization and people. And so I'd become kind of like a misanthrope, which I'm not naturally, but that was sort of my attitude when I left. And so all of these contacts along the way were sort of slowly piecemeal restored my, you know, sense of the importance of human relationships. And so I tell them in the book, many of them, as a way of sort of making that point.
Nice. Did you see Steve's question in the chat? How often did
you resupply? Okay, thank you, Steve. The plan was every 2 weeks, and it pretty much happened that way. So I had boxes that I'd put together beforehand of food and maps. And each one was 2 weeks worth of food, and I had someone sending them out to me to post offices, sometimes general delivery, where they would wait for me to be picked up. And in a few places, I had made contact beforehand with cross-country ski clubs. And in those cases, a few people had volunteered to, you know, accept these parcels at their homes, and I would go and find these people and pick up the box. And in that case, you usually get invited to spend the night. I see another question from Thomas. How did you navigate just maps and compass? Did you ever feel lost? All right. Yes, just maps and compass. I'm kind of a Luddite by temperament, but also I just didn't want to have, I wanted to have as few batteries as possible. And did you ever feel lost? Yes, not truly lost as in I had no idea where I was. I tended to have a sense of where I was on the map, but there were a couple of times when I thought I would be able to get through. Like there was a section in Saskatchewan where the snow was really deep and there were lots of lakes and like just huge sections that I had to break trail, which can be exhausting in deep snow. And so it's something that if there was a way to avoid it, I was going to try to avoid it. So like if I knew there was going to be a snowmobile trail somewhere, or I was going to have to cross 20 miles breaking trail, I was going to seek out the snowmobile trail. And so a couple of times I had to kind of gamble on finding a snowmobile trail link to some other lake. And in one day in particular, I skied an entire day, like on such a gamble, and then just kind of came up against this wall of snow, and there was a long way to go on the other side. And so I ended up having to turn off. I decided to backtrack, ski back a whole day, and then around a different way. So that kind of thing. And then again, crossing the mountains at British Columbia, there was one point when I couldn't find an opening to a trail that I knew existed somewhere. There was kind of a trail that came into this large clearing, and then it continued somewhere else, but I couldn't find where it continued, but I eventually did. So those were really the only two times where I felt lost in any sense. I can't hear you, Susan.
There you go. Somebody asked in the Q&A if you had any equipment break.
All right, thank you for the question. I expected to wear through a sled. So my sled was polyethylene, pretty heavy duty plastic, but I knew I was going to be covering a lot of terrain, and sometimes I wasn't sure how clean the snow would be, whether I'd be skiing over, like dragging it across rocks or anything like that. And so I thought the chances were pretty good that I might wear out a sled. And in fact, I did about halfway through the winter. And so I had the second one mailed to a post office where I had where I was expecting to find a food drop. And so I did that. And it was just like, there were like these long kind of lacerations in the bottom of the sled. So it still worked, but it would fill up with snow every few hours. And then the sled would weigh twice as much. And then the other thing, I broke a pole at one point. I was able to epoxy that back together when I got to the next town. In the meantime, I cut down a little birch tree to use as a pole. And then finally, just very near the end of the journey, I partially tore out one of the edges of my ski. And I fixed it once with epoxy when I was in a town. And then that happened again the very last day. And at that point, it wasn't really worth doing anything about. Aren't the trails obscured by deep snow, says Stephen. Yes, sometimes. So I mean, again, like as I mentioned during the talk, what I had to think of trails in very broad terms. So, as long as they're in the forest, of course, they're demarcated by trees on either side. And, in the mountains, for example, I was kind of skiing up a valley towards a pass. And so it was pretty intuitive where the trail would be, like at the bottom of the valley. And then lakes, of course, that was using my compass to get across. But you had to try to get to the place where there was going to be a trail, at the other side of the lake. And so sometimes seeing those trails was hard, but not so much because they were buried in snow, but just because, this is in this boreal forest, the forest is really, really dense. It's not like we have pretty open forests in New Hampshire, except up high. Like, think of like when you're up in the White Mountains up high in the like Krumholtz, like that's what the forest is like. It's really dense spruce trees everywhere. And so when you'd have these canoe trails to follow, there would be like this tiny opening, just the width of a canoe. And it's like this dark entrance. And sometimes it's very hard to, like with blowing snow and everything, to find that little opening that you were looking for. But in the problem with this deep snow on trails was not so much finding the trails, but sometimes it was just having to break a trail and hauling along 120 pounds behind you, which made it very hard going. Did you learn anything? Sorry, I see Thomas asks again, did you learn anything about yourself that surprised you? I did, yeah, a lot of things. And I talk quite a bit about this in the last part of the book. But one of the big things, and it's building on what I said before, I said I'd become kind of a misanthrope by the time I'd set off, which I'm not naturally, but I certainly am an introverted and kind of reserved person. But I actually learned that I like people, that I really like. which to most people, like, obviously, you know, who doesn't like people? But I think that to the kind of person who decides to go on a journey like this has kind of at least a hermit streak about them naturally. And so I realized that that's just one facet of my personality, and that doesn't need to define who I am. And so my friendships have become much more something that I value much more, both old and new ones. And there are other things too, but I'll leave it. I'll give it the simple answer. What kind of food did you bring? I had a variety of things. So my main warm meal of the day was supper, and I dehydrated a bunch of food myself before I set off. And it was kind of combinations of, I would have a starch, whether it was pasta or rice or quinoa, things like that. And then dried vegetables, and then a dried meat, which could be beef or chicken or tuna fish. And then I kind of put these three things together with spices and whatnot in various combinations, some more appetizing than others, as it turned out. And I would just basically just pour hot water over those, and then I had a little cook pot, and I would stick it into this cozy that I'd made from like a windshield reflector, basically. And it would kind of cook on its own in there once I poured the hot water in. And so that was my supper. And I would always carry around a big block of butter with me. And so every time I poured the food into the cook pot, I would chop a couple of inches of butter off this block of butter, drop it in there, and then that would boost the calorie count. And then for breakfast and lunch, there wasn't really a distinction. I had like energy bars and chocolate and nuts and dried fruit, stuff like that. And every morning I would just sort of stuff a bunch of that into my pockets in my jacket and just kind of eat on the go whenever it occurred to me. And then there was, in my thermos, sometimes I would put like hot cocoa or lemonade mix, again, to get sugar. And so that was my diet. Not the healthiest of diets.
You needed the calories, so that's good.
What will be your next adventure, asks Thomas. Well, nothing in the wintertime. I still do a lot of cross-country skiing, but I always come home in the evening. I don't feel the need to sleep out in the cold anymore. No, I've got a few ideas, but one of them that I'd like to write about is I would like to do a journey on foot. It's probably September or something like that, entirely between the hours of sunset and sunrise, and then write about night. And so the idea is to kind of do an experiment in making myself nocturnal. So it would be less about the book that I would like to write about. This would be less about the journey itself, and that experiment would just be sort of a way of looking at nighttime, as well ecologically, but also culturally and in all kinds of other ways. Did you meet any animals? I like the verb choice, meet. I did. I had met lots of animals, but although maybe not as many as I would have in the summertime. But there were the obvious ones like grouse and snowshoe hares, of which I saw hundreds. But then the kinds of animals we usually get more excited about meeting. I saw quite a few moose, especially in northeastern British Columbia, and one wolf over the course of the winter out on a lake. A ptarmigan, which is very exciting. Ptarmigans are those little partridges that turn white in the wintertime, and they're usually at high altitude or high latitude. I don't think we have them in New Hampshire. And a fisher also, which we do have in New Hampshire, but I have never seen one in New Hampshire, and so that was kind of exciting.
I have a question. Did you ever recreate that photo that spurred you on the journey originally with yourself?
I actually did that photo one better, in that I crossed a river like that, but it was deep. It was much deeper, and I actually had to strip down, climb into the river barefoot. No, actually, I had a pair of sneakers that I brought for just that purpose. And I had to ferry all my stuff across, like take apart my whole kit and do like 4 loads across the river, go to the other side, and wait to dry off, because I didn't have a towel or anything like that. Like sort of like with the water. I mean, this was in that first mountain section, so it wasn't like, it was cold. It was like in the 20s, but it wasn't, like 30 below or anything.
Bitter. Oh,
and then I had to suit back up and go onward. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Okay, I think we've exhausted all the questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone out there, for your questions and for your patience